Princess Isabella stood at the grand window of Rosewood Palace, watching the morning mist roll across the manicured gardens. Her delicate fingers traced patterns on the cold glass as tears threatened to spill from her emerald eyes. The weight of recent discoveries pressed heavily upon her shoulders, making even the simple act of breathing feel labored. The palace had always been her sanctuary, a place where she found solace amid the chaos of royal duties and public expectations. But, now, these same walls seemed to whisper secrets that made her stomach churn with unease. 3 weeks had passed since she returned from her humanitarian mission to the remote villages of Eldoria, and nothing felt the same anymore. During her absence, something had shifted in the palace dynamics. The servants moved differently, their eyes avoiding hers with an uncomfortable intensity. The usual warmth that greeted her return was replaced by an atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. Even her most trusted ladies-in-waiting seemed to carry secrets behind their carefully composed expressions. Isabella had initially attributed these changes to the natural adjustment period following her extended absence. After all, 3 months away from the palace was the longest she had ever been gone. The humanitarian work in Eldoria had been both physically and emotionally demanding, requiring her complete attention and energy. She had thrown herself into the mission with characteristic determination, organizing relief efforts for flood victims and establishing educational programs for displaced children. The work had been fulfilling in ways that royal ceremonies and state dinners never could be. In Eldoria, she was not just a princess performing duties, she was a woman making a real difference in people's lives. The gratitude in the villagers' eyes and the laughter of children who had lost everything but still found joy in simple pleasures reminded her why she had chosen to dedicate her life to service. But the isolation from palace life had also created an unexpected vulnerability. Without her usual network of trusted advisors and confidants, Isabella had relied heavily on written correspondence to stay connected to events at home. These letters, while informative about official matters, had failed to capture the subtle undercurrents of palace politics that were now becoming increasingly apparent. Her brother Prince Alexander had written regularly, his letters filled with updates about state affairs and diplomatic meetings. Her father, King Edward, had sent formal reports about legislative matters and international relations. Even her stepmother, Queen Sophia, had maintained correspondence, sharing news about social events and charitable functions. Yet none of these communications had prepared her for the reality she encountered upon her return. The first sign that something was amiss came during the welcome ceremony. Traditionally, the entire royal household would gather in the Grand Hall to celebrate a family member's return from an extended mission. The event would be filled with music, speeches, and genuine expressions of joy and relief. However, Isabella's homecoming felt strangely subdued, as if everyone was performing their roles rather than genuinely celebrating. Queen Sophia's embrace had lasted a moment too long, and her words of welcome seemed carefully rehearsed. The Queen's eyes, usually bright with maternal warmth, held a guarded quality that Isabella had never noticed before. During the ceremonial dinner that followed, conversations felt forced and artificial, lacking the natural flow of family interaction that had always characterized such gatherings. In the days that followed, Isabella began to notice other troubling changes. Her private secretary, Margaret, who had served the royal family for over 2 decades, seemed nervous and distracted during their morning briefings. Papers that should have been readily available took unusually long to locate, and simple questions about palace operations received evasive or incomplete answers. The household staff, once open and friendly, now maintained a professional distance that felt cold and unnatural. Maria, the head housekeeper who had practically raised Isabella, would barely make eye contact during their encounters. The gardeners who used to eagerly share updates about the princess's favorite rose varieties now offered only polite nods before quickly returning to their work. Most disturbing of all were the changes in Queen Sophia's behavior. The woman who had married Isabella's father 10 years ago and gradually earned the princess's trust and affection now seemed like a stranger wearing a familiar face. Their traditional afternoon tea sessions, once filled with laughter and intimate conversation, had become awkward affairs marked by long silences and forced pleasantries. Isabella tried to rationalize these observations, telling herself that perhaps she was the one who had changed during her time away. The experiences in Eldoria had certainly affected her perspective on many things. She had seen poverty and suffering that made palace concerns seem trivial in comparison. Perhaps her own transformation was creating a barrier between herself and others. But, deep in her heart, Isabella knew that something more significant was at play. The instincts that had been honed through years of navigating complex political situations were sending clear warning signals. Someone or something was threatening the delicate balance of trust and loyalty that held the royal household together. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon when Isabella discovered a letter that had been misfiled in her correspondence. The envelope bore the royal seal but was addressed to Queen Sophia, not to her. The letter had somehow ended up mixed in with Isabella's personal mail, likely due to the confusion surrounding her return and the reorganization of accumulated correspondence. Isabella's first instinct was to immediately return the letter to its rightful recipient. However, as she lifted the envelope to set it aside, she noticed that it had already been opened and resealed. The wax seal bore signs of tampering, and the edges of the envelope showed were consistent with multiple handlings. Curiosity and concern overcame her usual respect for privacy. The letter's contents made her blood run cold. Written in an unfamiliar hand, it detailed arrangements for transferring funds from royal accounts to private holdings. The language was deliberately vague, but the implications were clear enough to make Isabella's hands shake as she read. References to discretionary expenses and personal security measures suggested financial improprieties that could shake the very foundation of the monarchy. But it was the letter's conclusion that truly devastated Isabella. The writer expressed gratitude for Queen Sophia's continued cooperation in maintaining discretion regarding the princess's extended absence and the opportunities it provided. The phrase was cryptic, but its meaning became clearer when combined with the financial information detailed earlier in the correspondence. Isabella sat in stunned silence, the letter trembling in her hands. The woman she had come to love as a second mother, the person she had trusted with her deepest secrets and fears, appeared to be involved in some form of deception or corruption. The very thought seemed impossible, yet the evidence lay before her in black and white. The princess spent the remainder of that afternoon locked in her private chambers, alternating between disbelief and growing anger. She read and reread the letter, searching for alternative interpretations that might exonerate Queen Sophia. Perhaps the letter was a forgery, designed to create discord within the royal family. Maybe it was part of some elaborate test or security measure that she didn't understand. But, as evening approached and Isabella had time to reflect on recent events, pieces of a disturbing puzzle began to fall into place. The subtle changes in household behavior, the evasive responses to simple questions, the uncomfortable atmosphere that had greeted her return, all of these phenomena now took on new and ominous significance. Queen Sophia's frequent absences during important palace meetings, which Isabella had previously attributed to legitimate personal commitments, now seemed suspicious. The Queen's newfound interest in reviewing financial reports and personnel files, presented as a desire to be more involved in palace management, appeared in a different light. Even her stepmother's excessive concern about Isabella's well-being and suggestions that the princess take extended vacations seemed less like maternal care and more like strategic maneuvering. The realization that she might have been deliberately isolated and deceived filled Isabella with a rage she had rarely experienced. The betrayal cut deeper than any political machination or public criticism ever could. This was personal, intimate, and it struck at the heart of everything she believed about trust and family loyalty. As night fell over Rosewood Palace, Princess Isabella made a decision that would forever change her relationship with the institution she had been born to serve. She would not confront Queen Sophia directly, not yet. Instead, she would conduct her own investigation, carefully and methodically uncovering the truth about what had transpired during her absence. The innocent princess who had left for Eldoria 3 months ago was gone, replaced by a woman who now understood that even within the sanctuary of family, vigilance was essential. The tears that had threatened earlier finally fell, but they were no longer tears of confusion or hurt. They were tears of determination, marking the beginning of Isabella's transformation from trusting daughter to protective guardian of her family's honor and legacy. The moonlight streaming through her chamber windows illuminated the letter still clutched in her hands, its revelations serving as both evidence of betrayal and catalyst for the difficult journey that lay ahead. Isabella knew that uncovering the full truth would likely bring more pain and disillusionment, but she also understood that ignorance was no longer an option. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult choices, but tonight, in the solitude of her chambers, Princess Isabella began to plan her response to the forces that had sought to take advantage of her absence, and her trust the following morning brought with it a sense of purpose that Isabella had not felt since her return from Eldoria. She woke before dawn, her mind already racing with plans and possibilities. The letter remained hidden beneath her mattress, its contents burned into her memory like a brand. Today would mark the beginning of her investigation into the web of deception that had apparently been spun during her absence. Isabella's first priority was to establish a network of trusted allies within the palace. She needed information, but, more importantly, she needed people she could rely upon completely. The challenge lay in determining who, if anyone, remained loyal to her personally rather than to the institution or to Queen Sophia's influence. She began with Thomas Hartwell, the palace head of security who had served her family for over 15 years. Thomas had been personally selected by her father and had demonstrated unwavering loyalty through numerous challenges and crises. More significantly, he had been skeptical of Queen Sophia's marriage to the king from the beginning, though he had kept his reservations private and professional. Isabella found Thomas in his office, reviewing overnight security reports as was his morning custom. The man's weathered face bore the marks of years spent protecting the royal family, and his sharp gray eyes missed nothing. When Isabella entered and carefully closed the door behind her, Thomas immediately sensed the gravity of the situation. "Your Highness," he said, rising from his desk with the respectful formality that had never wavered despite their years of acquaintance. "How may I be of service?" Isabella moved to the window, ostensibly to admire the morning view but actually to ensure they could not be overheard. "Thomas, I need to ask you something in complete confidence. During my time in Eldoria, did you notice anything unusual about palace operations? Any changes in routine, personnel, or protocols that seemed out of the ordinary?" Thomas remained silent for a long moment, his expression carefully neutral. Isabella could see the internal struggle playing out behind his eyes, the conflict between professional discretion and personal loyalty. Finally, he spoke with characteristic directness. "Your Highness, there were several matters that concerned me during your absence. However, I was instructed by Queen Sophia that these were temporary adjustments necessitated by your extended mission and should not be documented in official reports." The phrase "instructed by Queen Sophia" sent a chill down Isabella's spine. The head of security reported directly to the king or, in his absence, to the designated heir, which was Isabella herself. Queen Sophia had no official authority to issue directives to palace security, yet she had apparently done so with sufficient conviction to make Thomas comply. "What kind of adjustments?" Isabella asked, keeping her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. Thomas moved to a filing cabinet and withdrew a folder that appeared to have been hastily assembled. Additional personnel were granted access to restricted areas, including the royal financial offices. Several new staff members were hired without following standard security protocols. There were also numerous after-hours meetings in the Queen's private chambers that required special security arrangements. Each revelation felt like another weight being added to Isabella's growing burden of knowledge. The financial offices housed sensitive information about royal assets, investments, and charitable funds. Unauthorized access to these areas could facilitate exactly the kind of improprieties suggested in the intercepted letter. Who were these additional personnel? Isabella inquired. "A mixture of individuals, Your Highness. Some claimed to be financial consultants working on modernizing the palace's accounting systems. Others were described as security specialists conducting efficiency reviews. All came with credentials that appeared legitimate, though I was not permitted to conduct my usual background verifications." Isabella felt her anger building, but she forced herself to remain calm and analytical. "Thomas, I want you to compile a complete list of everyone who had access to restricted areas during my absence. Include dates, times, and the stated purpose of their visits." "Can you do this without drawing attention?" "Yes, Your Highness. I maintained my own records despite the instructions to avoid official documentation. I felt it was necessary for security purposes." The fact that Thomas had kept unofficial records despite direct orders to the contrary revealed both his professionalism and his underlying suspicions about the activities he had been asked to facilitate. Isabella felt a surge of gratitude for his foresight and loyalty. "There's something else," Thomas continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "During the final weeks of your absence, Queen Sophia began making inquiries about your mission in Eldoria. She wanted detailed information about your daily activities, the people you were meeting with, and your expected return date. She claimed it was for security purposes, but her questions seemed unusually specific and personal. This information was particularly disturbing because it suggested that Queen Sophia's activities were somehow tied to Isabella's absence from the palace. The timing was too coincidental to be innocent, and the detailed inquiries about Isabella's movements implied a level of surveillance that went far beyond normal security concerns." After leaving Thomas with instructions to gather the requested information, Isabella next sought out Father Benedict, the palace chaplain who had served as her confessor and spiritual advisor for many years. If anyone would have insights into the moral and ethical dimensions of recent events, it would be the elderly priest who had observed the royal family through numerous trials and tribulations. Father Benedict maintained a small office in the palace chapel, a quiet sanctuary filled with religious texts and personal mementos from his decades of service. When Isabella arrived, she found him preparing for morning prayers, his white hair catching the sunlight that streamed through the stained glass windows. "My dear child," he said with the gentle warmth that had always made Isabella feel safe and understood. "I sense that something troubles you deeply. Please, sit and tell me what weighs upon your heart." Isabella had planned to approach the conversation carefully, revealing information gradually to gauge Father Benedict's reactions. However, the priest's immediate recognition of her distress and his invitation to share her burdens broke down her carefully constructed defenses. "Father, I have discovered something that makes me question everything I thought I knew about the people closest to me," she began, her voice barely steady. "I need guidance about how to proceed when truth and loyalty seem to be in conflict." Father Benedict nodded sagely, settling into his chair with the patient attention that had made him such an effective counselor over the years. "Truth can indeed be a burden, especially when it involves those we love. But remember that love without truth is merely sentiment, and truth without love is merely judgment. Both are required for wisdom." Encouraged by his response, Isabella shared the contents of the intercepted letter and the disturbing information she had learned from Thomas. She watched Father Benedict's expression grow increasingly grave as the full scope of the situation became clear. "I have suspected for some time that Queen Sophia was involved in activities that were not entirely consistent with her public role," Father Benedict admitted after Isabella finished her account. "During your absence, she began requesting access to historical records about royal finances and legal precedents regarding royal prerogatives. She claimed to be researching these matters for a book she was writing, but her questions were far too specific and practical for academic purposes." The priest's confirmation of Isabella's suspicions provided both validation and additional cause for concern. If Father Benedict, known for his charitable interpretations of human behavior, had developed doubts about Queen Sophia's activities, then the situation was likely even more serious than Isabella had initially believed. "What would you advise me to do?" Isabella asked, genuinely uncertain about the best course of action. Father Benedict was quiet for several minutes, his fingers moving over his rosary beads in a gesture Isabella recognized as his way of seeking divine guidance for difficult decisions. Finally, he looked up with the clarity that came from years of wrestling with moral complexities. "You must continue to seek the truth, but you must also prepare yourself for the possibility that the truth may require you to take actions that will cause pain to people you care about. Queen Sophia may have become entangled in something she cannot easily escape, or she may have made choices that reflect a fundamental change in her character. Either way, your responsibility is to protect the institution you will one day lead and the people it serves." As Isabella left the chapel, she felt both strengthened by Father Benedict's support and sobered by his warning about the difficult choices that lay ahead. The investigation was no longer just about satisfying her curiosity or resolving personal doubts. It had become a matter of duty and responsibility that transcended her individual feelings and relationships. Her next stop was the palace library, where she hoped to find Eleanor Ashford, the royal librarian who had been with the family since before Isabella's birth. Eleanor possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of palace history and procedures, and her position gave her access to records and documents that might shed light on the current situation. Eleanor was cataloging new acquisitions when Isabella arrived, her silver hair pulled back in the neat bun she had worn for as long as Isabella could remember. The librarian's face lit up with genuine pleasure at seeing the princess, a reaction that provided Isabella with her first truly warm welcome since returning from Eldoria. "Your Highness! How wonderful to see you looking so well. Your work in Eldoria was truly inspiring. We followed the news reports with great interest and pride." The sincere enthusiasm in Eleanor's voice was a balm to Isabella's wounded spirit. Here, at last, was someone whose reaction seemed completely natural and unguarded. However, Isabella knew she needed to be cautious about how much she revealed, even to someone she trusted implicitly. "Eleanor, I'm trying to understand some changes that occurred during my absence. I wonder if you might help me research some matters related to royal financial management and the proper procedures for authorizing expenditures." Eleanor's expression immediately became more serious and attentive. As the keeper of royal records, she took her responsibilities very seriously and was always willing to assist with official inquiries. "Of course, Your Highness. What specific information are you seeking?" Isabella had prepared for this question by developing a plausible cover story that would allow her to gather necessary information without immediately revealing her suspicions about Queen Sophia. "I'm concerned that my extended absence may have created some confusion about proper authorization procedures. I want to review the protocols to ensure that everything has been handled correctly and that no mistakes were made due to unclear lines of authority." Eleanor nodded understandingly and moved to a section of the library that housed administrative records and procedural manuals. These volumes contained the complete protocols for financial management, including the specific requirements for different types of expenditures and the proper authorization procedures for various circumstances. As Eleanor pulled several thick volumes from the shelves, she continued speaking in a tone that suggested she was choosing her words carefully. "Your Highness, I should mention that during your absence, there were several requests for access to these same records. Queen Sophia expressed particular interest in the sections dealing with discretionary funds and emergency expenditure protocols." Isabella felt her pulse quicken, but she maintained her composure. "Did she explain why she needed this information?" "She mentioned that she was working on modernizing palace administrative procedures and wanted to ensure that all protocols were up to date and properly documented. However, some of her questions seemed to focus more on identifying potential loopholes or exceptions rather than understanding standard procedures. This revelation was particularly alarming because it suggested that Queen Sophia had been actively researching ways to circumvent normal oversight mechanisms. The fact that she had focused on discretionary funds and emergency protocols indicated a sophisticated understanding of how royal finances could be manipulated. Eleanor continued gathering documents, but Isabella could see that the librarian had more to say. After several minutes of silence, Eleanor spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your Highness, I hope you won't think me inappropriate for mentioning this, but I was troubled by some of the Queen's requests. She asked about historical precedents for situations where a royal family member might need to access funds without the knowledge of other family members. She claimed it was for research purposes, but the question seemed very specific and urgent. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together with frightening clarity. Queen Sophia had not only been involved in questionable financial activities during Isabella's absence, but she had also been actively researching how to continue these activities while avoiding detection and accountability. Isabella spent the rest of the morning in the library, reviewing the financial protocols and making careful notes about proper procedures and oversight mechanisms. The more she learned, the more apparent it became that Queen Sophia's activities represented serious violations of both palace policies and legal requirements. As the day progressed, Isabella found herself faced with a growing mountain of evidence and a corresponding increase in the weight of responsibility. The investigation that had begun as an attempt to understand subtle changes in palace atmosphere had evolved into the uncovering of what appeared to be systematic financial impropriety and abuse of royal authority. The afternoon brought a summons to tea with Queen Sophia, a weekly tradition that had been suspended during Isabella's mission to Eldoria. As Isabella prepared for this encounter, she knew that it would require all of her diplomatic skills to maintain the pretense of normalcy while carefully observing her stepmother's behavior for additional clues about the true extent of her involvement in recent events. The afternoon tea with Queen Sophia was scheduled for 4 o'clock in the Queen's private sitting room, a beautifully appointed space that had once been Isabella's favorite place in the palace. The room held memories of countless conversations, shared confidences, and moments of genuine maternal affection that had helped heal the wounds left by Isabella's mother's death when she was only 12 years old. As Isabella approached the familiar door, she felt a profound sense of loss that went beyond the immediate crisis. Regardless of what she discovered about Queen Sophia's recent activities, their relationship had been fundamentally altered. The trust and intimacy they had built over 10 years could never be fully restored, even if there were innocent explanations for everything that had occurred. Queen Sophia was arranging flowers when Isabella entered, her graceful movements and elegant appearance unchanged despite the turmoil that surrounded her. She looked up with a smile that seemed genuine, though Isabella now found herself analyzing every expression and gesture for signs of deception. "Darling, I've missed our afternoon chat so much. Please, sit and tell me all about your experiences in Eldoria. I want to hear everything." The official reports never capture the personal side of these missions. The warmth in Queen Sophia's voice was achingly familiar, and, for a moment, Isabella felt her resolve waver. This was the woman who had comforted her through adolescent heartbreaks, celebrated her achievements, and provided wise counsel during difficult decisions. The possibility that this same person could be capable of betrayal seemed almost impossible to accept. Isabella settled into her usual chair, a comfortable armchair positioned to catch the afternoon light from the tall windows. The tea service was laid out with the fine china that had been a wedding gift from Isabella's grandmother, and everything appeared exactly as it always had during their traditional weekly meetings. Eldoria was transformative in many ways, Isabella began, choosing her words carefully. "Working directly with people who had lost everything made me think about the responsibilities we carry and the trust that's placed in us. It also made me appreciate how important it is to have reliable people around us, people whose loyalty and integrity are beyond question." She watched Queen Sophia's face as she spoke, looking for any reaction that might reveal guilt or discomfort. The Queen's expression remained attentive and interested, showing no obvious signs of distress at Isabella's emphasis on loyalty and integrity. "I can imagine how meaningful that work must have been," Queen Sophia replied, pouring tea with practiced elegance. "Sometimes we need to step away from our usual environment to gain perspective on what truly matters. I hope the time away also gave you some rest. You've been working so hard in recent years." The mention of Isabella's absence created an opening for more pointed questions. "I appreciate your concern about my workload. I hope my being away didn't create too much additional burden for you. I know managing palace affairs can be overwhelming when responsibilities aren't clearly distributed." Queen Sophia's hand paused almost imperceptibly as she passed Isabella her teacup, and, for just a moment, her composure seemed to slip. However, she recovered quickly and maintained her warm, conversational tone. "Oh, not at all, dear. Everyone was very cooperative, and we managed quite well. Your father was traveling so much for diplomatic meetings, so I did try to stay more involved in day-to-day operations than usual. I hope I didn't overstep any boundaries. I was just trying to ensure everything ran smoothly until you returned." This acknowledgement of increased involvement in palace operations provided Isabella with the opening she needed to probe more deeply without appearing suspicious. "I'm grateful for your help, and I'm sure everyone appreciated your attention to details that might otherwise have been overlooked. Thomas mentioned that you worked very closely with the administrative staff. Were there any particular areas that required special attention?" Queen Sophia set down her teacup and moved to the window, a gesture that Isabella recognized as a nervous habit. When she spoke again, her voice carried a slight tension that hadn't been there moments before. "Well, there were some questions about updating our financial management systems. The current procedures seem rather outdated, and I thought it might be helpful to modernize things while you were away and wouldn't be inconvenienced by the disruption." The admission of involvement in financial matters was exactly what Isabella had been hoping to hear, but it also confirmed her worst fears about Queen Sophia's activities. The casual way in which the Queen described these actions suggested either complete innocence or remarkable composure in the face of direct questioning. That was thoughtful of you, Isabella replied, maintaining her own facade of casual interest. What kind of modernization did you implement? I'd like to understand the changes so I can work effectively with the new systems. Queen Sophia returned to her chair, but her movements seemed less fluid and natural than they had been earlier. She was clearly becoming uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, though she was trying to hide her discomfort behind continued pleasantries. Oh, nothing too dramatic. We brought in some consultants to review our procedures and make recommendations for improvements. Most of their work was preliminary, just gathering information and identifying potential areas for enhancement. The mention of consultants aligned perfectly with the information Isabella had received from Thomas about additional personnel being granted access to restricted areas. However, Queen Sophia's description of their work as preliminary contradicted the evidence suggesting that significant changes had actually been implemented. Isabella decided to press the issue more directly. I'd like to meet with these consultants to understand their recommendations. Are they still working with us? No, their contract ended shortly before your return, Queen Sophia said quickly. Their report was quite technical, and I thought it would be better to discuss it with you before moving forward with any of their suggestions. This explanation was plausible on the surface, but it raised additional questions about why consultants would be hired to conduct a comprehensive review only to have their work suspended before implementation. It also seemed convenient that they had departed just before Isabella's return, eliminating the possibility of her speaking with them directly. I'd very much like to review their report, Isabella said. Could you arrange for me to see a copy? For the first time since the conversation began, Queen Sophia appeared genuinely flustered. She rose from her chair and began rearranging the flower arrangement she had been working on when Isabella arrived, her movements sharp and agitated. The report is quite lengthy and technical. Perhaps it would be more efficient if I summarized their key findings for you first, and then you could review the full document if you felt it was necessary. Isabella recognized this as a delaying tactic, and the Queen's obvious reluctance to provide the report immediately raised serious questions about its contents. A legitimate consulting report should be readily available and would likely contain recommendations that could be easily explained and justified. I appreciate your offer to summarize, but I think it would be better for me to review the complete report myself. As the heir to the throne, I need to understand all aspects of palace operations, including the technical details that might seem tedious but could be quite important. Queen Sophia abandoned her flower arrangement and turned to face Isabella directly. For the first time, her mask of maternal warmth slipped completely, replaced by an expression that was harder and more calculating than any Isabella had ever seen from her stepmother. Isabella, I think you're making too much of what were really very routine administrative matters. The consultant's work was preliminary, as I said, and their report wouldn't be particularly useful without significant context and explanation. The change in Queen Sophia's tone and demeanor was startling. Gone was the gentle, nurturing woman who had raised Isabella through her teenage years. In her place was someone who seemed almost like a stranger, someone whose primary concern appeared to be maintaining control over information rather than supporting Isabella's legitimate interest in palace affairs. I understand that these matters can be complex, Isabella replied carefully, but I don't think administrative issues should be kept from me, regardless of how routine they might seem. I need to be fully informed about all aspects of palace operations. Queen Sophia was quiet for a long moment, and Isabella could almost see her weighing different responses and calculating the potential consequences of each option. When she finally spoke, her words were measured and deliberate. Of course you're right to want complete information. I was only trying to spare you unnecessary work while you're still readjusting from your mission. The report is in my private study, and I'll have it sent to your chambers this evening. Isabella nodded acknowledgement, though she suspected that the report Queen Sophia eventually provided would be heavily edited or possibly fabricated entirely. The Queen's behavior during their conversation had revealed far more than any document could, confirming that significant deception had indeed taken place during Isabella's absence. The remainder of their tea time passed in awkward conversation about neutral topics, both women apparently recognizing that their relationship had crossed some invisible line from which there could be no return to their previous intimacy. When Isabella finally excused herself, she felt emotionally drained but also grimly satisfied that her investigation was yielding concrete results. That evening, Isabella met secretly with Thomas in his security office to share what she had learned and to review the information he had gathered about personnel and activities during her absence. The picture that emerged from their combined research was deeply troubling and suggested a level of premeditation and organization that went far beyond simple financial impropriety. "Your Highness," Thomas said, spreading documents across his desk, "the pattern of activities I've documented suggests that Queen Sophia was working with a coordinated group of individuals to gain access to and manipulate royal financial resources. The timing of various meetings and document reviews indicates careful planning rather than opportunistic actions." The documents Thomas had compiled painted a detailed picture of systematic infiltration and exploitation. Financial consultants had been granted access to accounts that contained millions in royal assets. Security protocols had been modified to allow after-hours access to sensitive areas. Personnel records had been altered to obscure the true identities and qualifications of temporary staff members. Most significantly, Thomas had discovered evidence that funds had actually been transferred from royal accounts to private holdings, exactly as suggested in the intercepted letter. The amounts involved were substantial enough to constitute serious criminal activity, and the methods used to obscure the transaction showed sophisticated knowledge of both palace procedures and financial manipulation techniques. "How much money are we talking about?" Isabella asked, though she dreaded the answer. Thomas consulted his notes before responding. "Preliminary estimates suggest that over £2 million may have been diverted from various royal accounts. The full extent won't be clear until we conduct a comprehensive audit, but the evidence indicates ongoing activity over several months." The magnitude of the theft was staggering, not just in financial terms but also in its implications for the integrity of the royal institution. Public revelation of such systematic corruption could irreparably damage the monarchy's reputation and undermine the trust upon which the entire system depended. Isabella spent the rest of the evening grappling with the enormity of the situation and the difficult decisions that lay ahead. She now possessed evidence of serious criminal activity involving someone she had loved and trusted. The choices she made in the coming days would affect not only her personal relationships but also the future of the crown she would one day wear. As she prepared for bed, Isabella reflected on how dramatically her world had changed in just a few short days. The idealistic princess who had returned from Eldoria with hope and optimism had been replaced by a woman forced to confront the darkest aspects of power and betrayal. The transformation was painful, but it was also necessary for the responsibility she would ultimately bear. Tomorrow would bring new revelations and even more difficult choices, but Isabella was beginning to understand that protecting the crown might require sacrificing the personal relationships that had once provided her greatest comfort and support. The next morning brought an unexpected development that would dramatically alter the course of Isabella's investigation. She was awakened before dawn by Margaret, her private secretary, who appeared at her bedside with obvious distress and urgent news. "Your Highness, forgive the early hour, but there's been a development that requires your immediate attention," Margaret whispered, glancing nervously toward the door. "One of the palace guards, James Morton, has requested a private audience with you. He claims to have information about activities that occurred during your absence, and he seems quite agitated." Isabella's pulse quickened as she processed this information. James Morton was one of the newer guards, having been hired only 6 months before her departure for Eldoria. She knew him primarily by sight and reputation, though other staff members had spoken favorably of his diligence and professionalism. "Where is he now?" Isabella asked, quickly rising and reaching for her robe. "He's waiting in the small conference room adjacent to the security office. Thomas is with him, but James insisted that he would only speak freely in your presence. Your Highness, he appears genuinely frightened." Isabella dressed quickly and made her way through the quiet corridors of the palace, her mind racing with possibilities about what James might reveal. The fact that he had specifically requested to speak with her, despite the potential consequences for his career, suggested that his information was both significant and sensitive. She found James pacing nervously in the small conference room, his usually composed demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety. Thomas stood nearby, his expression grim in a way that told Isabella this meeting was likely to be as difficult as it was important. James, Isabella said gently, taking a seat to make their conversation feel less formal and intimidating. Margaret tells me you have something important to share. Please, sit down and tell me what's troubling you. James remained standing for a moment, clearly struggling with internal conflicts about the wisdom of speaking out. Finally, he took a deep breath and sat across from Isabella, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. Your Highness, I've been wrestling with this decision for weeks, ever since you returned from your mission. What I witnessed during your absence has been eating at me, but I was afraid to speak because I thought no one would believe me, or worse, that I might lose my position for making accusations against Queen Sophia. The mention of Queen Sophia's name sent a chill through Isabella, though she was careful to maintain an encouraging and non-judgmental expression. James, I want you to know that you're safe here, and anything you tell me will be treated with complete confidentiality until we determine how best to proceed. Reassured by Isabella's words, James began to speak more steadily, though his voice still carried the strain of someone unburdening a heavy secret. During the final month of your absence, I was assigned to night duty in the section of the palace that includes the administrative offices. It's normally a quiet posting, with very little activity after standard business hours. However, I began noticing unusual patterns of after-hours access to restricted areas. Isabella leaned forward slightly, encouraging James to continue while being careful not to appear too eager or leading in her responses. At first, I thought nothing of it. Queen Sophia occasionally worked late, and she had authorization to access most areas of the palace. But then, I began to notice that she was meeting with people I didn't recognize, and these meetings were happening in offices that should have been secured after normal working hours. This information aligned perfectly with Thomas's earlier reports about additional personnel and modified security protocols, but James's direct observations provided crucial eyewitness testimony that could not be dismissed or explained away. Can you describe these people? Isabella asked. There were usually 2 or 3 individuals, always well-dressed and professional-looking. They carried briefcases and seemed to know their way around the palace, suggesting they had been there multiple times before. What struck me as odd was that their visits weren't logged in the official security records, and Queen Sophia specifically instructed me not to document their presence. The instruction to avoid official documentation was particularly damning, as it suggested deliberate attempts to conceal activities that should have been transparent and properly recorded. Did you overhear any of their conversations? Isabella inquired. James hesitated before answering, clearly uncomfortable with admitting that he had listened to private conversations. I didn't intentionally eavesdrop, Your Highness, but the palace walls are old and sound carries more than people realize. During one of their meetings, I overheard discussion about transferring assets and the importance of completing certain transactions before your return. Isabella felt her stomach tighten as James's testimony provided direct confirmation of the financial improprieties she had already suspected. The reference to completing transactions before her return demonstrated that her absence had been a crucial factor in enabling Queen Sophia's activities. Was there anything else you observed that seemed unusual or concerning? James was quiet for several moments, and Isabella could see that he was debating whether to share information that might be even more damaging than what he had already revealed. Your Highness, on 2 separate occasions, I saw Queen Sophia removing documents from the royal financial offices and taking them to her private chambers. When she returned later that evening, she was carrying different documents, and she used her personal authorization codes to access the secure filing systems. This revelation was particularly significant because it suggested that Queen Sophia had been actively manipulating official records, not just accessing funds inappropriately. Document substitution was a sophisticated form of fraud that could be used to conceal financial crimes for extended periods. Thomas, who had remained silent during most of James's testimony, now spoke for the first time. James, I want you to think very carefully about this next question. Did you ever see Queen Sophia removing or destroying any documents rather than simply replacing them? James nodded grimly. Yes, sir. On the last night I witnessed one of these meetings, I saw her feeding papers into the fireplace in her private sitting room. She seemed very focused on making sure the documents were completely destroyed. The destruction of documents represented potential evidence tampering and obstruction of justice, elevating Queen Sophia's activities from financial impropriety to more serious criminal behavior. Isabella felt a profound sadness wash over her as the full scope of her stepmother's betrayal became clear. "James," Isabella said, "I want to thank you for your courage in bringing this information forward. I know it wasn't an easy decision, and I want you to know that your loyalty and integrity will not be forgotten." After James left the room, Isabella and Thomas sat in heavy silence, both processing the implications of what they had just heard. The guard's testimony provided crucial corroboration for their suspicions and offered details that would be essential if formal legal action became necessary. "Thomas," Isabella finally said, "we need to secure whatever evidence still exists before it can be destroyed or hidden. How quickly can you arrange for a comprehensive audit of the financial records?" "I can have external auditors here within 24 hours, Thomas replied. "However, conducting a thorough investigation will require cooperation from Queen Sophia, and she's unlikely to provide that willingly once she realizes what we're doing." Isabella understood the dilemma perfectly. A comprehensive investigation would inevitably expose Queen Sophia's activities, but attempting to conduct such an investigation secretly might allow crucial evidence to be destroyed while also raising questions about proper legal procedures. "What if we approach this differently?" Isabella suggested. "Rather than launching a formal audit immediately, what if we first try to secure the most critical evidence through other means?" Thomas looked puzzled. "What did you have in mind, Your Highness?" Isabella had been formulating a plan even as James shared his testimony, and she was beginning to see a way forward that might allow them to gather conclusive evidence while minimizing the immediate damage to the royal family's reputation. James mentioned seeing Queen Sophia remove documents from the financial offices. If she's been systematically replacing official records with falsified versions, then the authentic documents might still exist in her private chambers. If we could recover those original records, we would have proof of the extent of her activities. Thomas considered this suggestion carefully. That would require accessing Queen Sophia's private chambers without her knowledge or consent. Such action would have serious legal and political implications, regardless of what we might discover. Isabella recognized the gravity of what she was proposing, but she also understood that traditional investigative methods might be insufficient given Queen Sophia's position and influence within the palace hierarchy. The alternative is to allow her to continue destroying evidence while we follow proper procedures that she can easily circumvent, Isabella pointed out. Sometimes protecting the institution requires taking actions that are personally difficult but ultimately necessary. Thomas nodded slowly, acknowledging the logic of Isabella's position while clearly remaining uncomfortable with the proposed course of action. "If we proceed with this plan," he said, "we would need to act quickly and with absolute certainty that we can recover meaningful evidence. Any attempt that fails to produce conclusive proof would be politically disastrous and could undermine your future ability to address this situation effectively." Isabella spent the remainder of the morning developing a detailed plan for accessing Queen Sophia's chambers and securing any evidence that might still exist. The operation would need to be conducted when the Queen was away from the palace, and it would require the cooperation of trusted staff members who could provide access and lookout services. The plan she eventually devised was risky but achievable. Queen Sophia had a standing appointment every Thursday afternoon with her personal physician in the city, a commitment that typically kept her away from the palace for at least 3 hours. During this window, Isabella and Thomas could conduct a thorough search of her private chambers with minimal risk of discovery. As the day progressed, Isabella found herself alternating between determination and profound sadness about the necessity of what she was planning. Searching through Queen Sophia's private belongings represented a fundamental violation of trust and privacy, even though it was motivated by the need to uncover evidence of betrayal and criminal activity. The irony was not lost on Isabella that she was being forced to violate Queen Sophia's privacy in order to expose how Queen Sophia had violated the family's trust. The symmetry was both poetic and tragic, representing the complete breakdown of the relationship that had once been one of the most important sources of stability and comfort in Isabella's life. That evening, Isabella received the promised consulting report from Queen Sophia, delivered by a servant with an accompanying note expressing hope that the technical details would not be too overwhelming. As Isabella had suspected, the document was clearly a fabrication, containing generic recommendations and superficial analysis that bore no relationship to the sophisticated financial manipulation that had actually occurred. The fakeness of the report provided additional evidence of Queen Sophia's deception, but it also demonstrated her continued commitment to maintaining her facade of innocence. This realization strengthened Isabella's resolve to proceed with the planned search, as it became clear that Queen Sophia would never voluntarily acknowledge her activities or cooperate with any investigation. As Isabella prepared for bed, she reflected on how completely her world had been transformed in less than a week. The innocent trust that had characterized her relationship with Queen Sophia was gone forever, replaced by the hard knowledge that even those closest to the throne could be corrupted by the power and resources at their disposal. Tomorrow would bring the most challenging day yet, as Isabella prepared to take decisive action to protect the crown from those who had sworn to serve it. The search of Queen Sophia's chambers would either provide the evidence needed to address the situation definitively, or it would mark the beginning of an even more complex and dangerous phase of the crisis that now threatened to engulf the entire royal family. Thursday afternoon arrived with an overcast sky that seemed to mirror Isabella's emotional state as she prepared for what could be the most consequential hours of her life. Queen Sophia had departed for her medical appointment precisely on schedule, her departure observed discreetly by Thomas from his security office window. The 3-hour window they had planned for was now officially open. Isabella made her way to Queen Sophia's private chambers with a sense of purpose tempered by profound sadness. These rooms had once been a sanctuary where she had sought comfort, advice, and maternal warmth. Now they represented a potential crime scene that might hold the evidence needed to expose systematic betrayal and financial fraud. Thomas met her at the entrance to the Queen's suite, carrying the specialized equipment they would need to document anything they discovered. His expression was grim but determined, reflecting his own internal struggle with the necessity of their actions. "Your Highness," he said quietly, "once we cross this threshold, there will be no returning to the way things were." "Are you certain you want to proceed?" Isabella took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. "Thomas, I became certain the moment I realized that my stepmother had violated the trust placed in her. Whatever personal pain this causes me is secondary to protecting the crown and the people it serves." They entered Queen Sophia's sitting room, and Isabella was immediately struck by how normal everything appeared. The comfortable furniture, family photographs, and personal mementos created an atmosphere of domestic tranquility that seemed completely at odds with the dark purpose of their visit. Thomas had developed a systematic approach for their search, beginning with the most likely locations for hidden documents and gradually expanding to cover the entire suite. They started with Queen Sophia's private study, a room that Isabella had rarely entered and which seemed the most probable repository for sensitive materials. The study was elegantly appointed with antique furniture and lined with bookcases containing a mixture of literature, biographies, and reference works. A large mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, its surface carefully organized with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that had always characterized Queen Sophia's approach to her royal duties. Thomas began examining the desk while Isabella focused on a filing cabinet that stood against the far wall. The cabinet was locked, but Thomas had come prepared with the necessary tools to gain access without leaving obvious signs of their search. The first drawer contained routine correspondence and household management documents, nothing that appeared relevant to their investigation. However, the second drawer yielded more promising results. Hidden beneath a collection of charitable organization files, Isabella discovered a folder containing bank statements and financial records that clearly did not belong to any legitimate royal accounts. "Thomas," she called softly, "I think I've found something." The documents Isabella had discovered detailed a series of transactions involving substantial sums of money being transferred from various royal accounts to private holdings in offshore banks. The amounts matched perfectly with the estimates Thomas had provided earlier, but seeing the actual records made the scope of the theft feel much more real and devastating. More disturbing than the financial records were the accompanying documents that revealed the sophisticated planning behind Queen Sophia's activities. There were detailed schedules coordinating her meetings with accomplices, careful timing calculations to ensure transactions occurred when oversight would be minimal, and even contingency plans for concealing evidence if suspicions arose. Thomas, meanwhile, had discovered a hidden compartment in Queen Sophia's desk that contained additional incriminating materials. Among these were copies of the original documents that had been replaced in the royal financial offices, providing clear evidence of the systematic falsification that James had witnessed. "Your Highness," Thomas said grimly, "what we found here represents far more than simple theft. This appears to be a comprehensive conspiracy to defraud the royal household, involving multiple accomplices and sophisticated methods of concealment. As they continued their search, the full extent of Queen Sophia's betrayal became increasingly apparent. They discovered correspondence with individuals who were clearly co-conspirators, detailed plans for additional thefts that had been scheduled for implementation after Isabella's return, and even discussions about potential strategies for deflecting suspicion if their activities were discovered. Perhaps most shocking of all was a series of documents that revealed Queen Sophia's motivations for her criminal activities. Rather than being driven by financial desperation or external coercion, she appeared to have been motivated by a sense of entitlement and resentment about her position within the royal family. In several handwritten notes, Queen Sophia expressed frustration about being treated as a secondary figure within the royal hierarchy and anger about what she perceived as inadequate financial compensation for her royal duties. The documents revealed a woman who felt undervalued and underpaid, and who had decided to remedy these perceived injustices through theft and fraud. Isabella found these revelations particularly painful because they suggested that Queen Sophia's feelings of affection and maternal care had been, at least partially, calculated performances designed to maintain her position and access within the royal household. The woman who had comforted Isabella through difficult times and celebrated her achievements may have been motivated as much by strategic calculation as by genuine emotion. As their 3-hour window began to narrow, Isabella and Thomas focused on documenting and securing the most crucial evidence they had discovered. They photographed key documents, made careful inventories of all materials, and prepared everything for eventual presentation to legal authorities. The final discovery of their search proved to be the most damning. Hidden in a jewelry box within Queen Sophia's bedroom, they found a detailed written confession that appeared to have been prepared as a form of insurance policy. In this document, Queen Sophia acknowledged her criminal activities and implicated several accomplices, apparently intending to use this confession as leverage if she were ever threatened with exposure. The confession revealed that Queen Sophia's criminal network extended beyond the palace walls and included financial professionals, corrupt officials, and other individuals who had facilitated her activities in exchange for substantial payments. The scope of the conspiracy was far larger than Isabella had initially imagined, suggesting that addressing the situation would require coordination with external law enforcement agencies. As they prepared to leave Queen Sophia's chambers, Isabella felt emotionally exhausted but also relieved that they had finally uncovered the complete truth about the activities that had occurred during her absence. The evidence they had gathered was comprehensive and conclusive, providing everything that would be needed to pursue both criminal charges and civil recovery of the stolen funds. However, Isabella also understood that possessing this evidence was only the beginning of a much larger and more complex challenge. Deciding how to use the information they had gathered would require careful consideration of legal requirements, political implications, and the potential impact on the royal family's reputation and public standing. That evening, Isabella convened a private meeting with Thomas, Father Benedict, and Eleanor to review their findings and develop a comprehensive strategy for addressing the crisis. The group spent hours analyzing the evidence and debating the various options available for proceeding. Father Benedict, as always, provided moral and ethical guidance that helped frame the discussion in terms of fundamental principles rather than immediate tactical considerations. "Isabella," he said, "your responsibility is not just to punish wrongdoing, but also to ensure that justice serves the greater good and helps restore the integrity that has been damaged." Eleanor, drawing on her extensive knowledge of royal history and precedent, offered insights into how similar situations had been handled in the past and what lessons could be learned from previous royal scandals. Thomas focused on the practical and legal requirements for ensuring that any actions they took would be effective and would stand up to eventual scrutiny from courts, investigators, and the public. Through their discussions, Isabella began to develop a comprehensive plan that would address the immediate criminal activities while also implementing reforms designed to prevent similar situations in the future. The plan would require careful coordination with legal authorities, delicate management of public relations concerns, and difficult personal decisions about Queen Sophia's future role within the royal family. The following morning, Isabella requested a private meeting with her father, King Edward, who had returned from his diplomatic travels the previous evening. This would be one of the most difficult conversations of her life, as she would need to inform her father that the woman he loved and had married had systematically betrayed the family and committed serious crimes against the crown. As she prepared for this meeting, Isabella reflected on how dramatically her understanding of leadership and responsibility had evolved over the past week. She had learned that protecting the crown sometimes required making decisions that caused personal pain, and that true loyalty to the institution might occasionally conflict with loyalty to individuals. The innocent princess who had departed for Eldoria was gone forever, replaced by a woman who understood that power carried with it the burden of making difficult choices for the greater good. The tears she had shed upon discovering Queen Sophia's initial deception had been replaced by a steely resolve to ensure that justice was served and that the royal institution emerged stronger from this crisis. When Isabella finally met with her father that morning, she carried with her not only the evidence of Queen Sophia's crimes, but also a comprehensive plan for addressing the situation in a way that would minimize damage to the monarchy while ensuring that appropriate consequences followed from the betrayal of trust that had occurred. The conversation with King Edward would mark the beginning of the final phase of the crisis, as the royal family prepared to confront the painful reality that one of their own had violated the sacred trust placed in those who serve the crown. Isabella knew that the decisions made in the coming days would define not only her own future as a leader, but also the future integrity and public standing of the royal institution she was destined to inherit. As she walked toward her father's private office, Isabella carried herself with a new sense of purpose and authority that reflected her transformation from protected princess to guardian of the crown's honor and integrity. The journey had been painful, but it had also prepared her for the complex challenges that would define her eventual reign as queen.